Black ember full script. All corrections applied. The cottonwood tree stood alone on the east side of the property, not far from where the ground rose slightly above the surrounding grassland. It was the only tree of any real size on the claim, and it had been there long before Ruth and Edmund Calloway ever arrived. The trunk was pale and thick, the bark furrowed deep in the way of old trees that have outlasted too many winters to count. On the morning Ruth buried her husband beneath it, the leaves were still green, still catching the light the way they always did, indifferent to what was happening below them. That indifference almost broke her. She had known Edmund for 31 years. She had been 32 when they married, old enough, by the standards of her time, to have thought carefully about the choice she was making. He had been a quiet man, methodical and deliberate, the kind of man who measured twice before cutting, who never made a promise he did not intend to keep. They had come to Bitterroot Flats together in the spring of 1857, when Ruth was 38 years old and the Dakota Territory was still more rumor than settled land. They had broken ground together. They had built the cabin together. They had watched the valley fill slowly with other families over the following decade, and they had watched some of those same families leave when the land proved harder than expected. Ruth and Edmund had stayed. 25 years they had worked that claim. 25 years of early frost and late rains and winds that never quite stopped. 25 years of the shallow well that gave out in dry summers and the cracked cabin walls that let in the cold, no matter how carefully Edmund patched them each autumn. 25 years of soil that took everything you gave it and asked for more. But they had stayed, and over time, the land had become something more than property to Ruth. It had become the shape of her life. Every fence post, every water channel, every depleted row of earth was a record of years spent in partnership with someone she trusted completely. Then Edmund caught a fever in late October. 3 weeks later, he was gone. She had not expected the silence. That was the part no one warned you about. The cabin was small, and Edmund had never been a talkative man, and yet somehow his absence filled every corner in a way his presence never had. The chair where he sat in the evenings, the peg beside the door where his coat hung, the sound of his boots on the floor in the morning, which she had woken to for so many years that she had stopped noticing it until it was no longer there. Brindle noticed. The old brown dog had spent the first week after Edmund's death walking slowly from room to room, nose close to the floor, stopping at each place his owner had been in the habit of resting. He would stand there for a moment perfectly still before moving on to the next. He did this without any visible distress, with the quiet seriousness of a creature conducting an inventory of everything that had changed. Ruth watched him and said nothing. She was 63 years old. She had buried parents, a sister, 2 neighbors she had called friends. She knew what grief felt like from the inside, the weight of it, the way it settled differently in the body than any other kind of exhaustion. This grief was different from the others in one specific way. All the others had left her life smaller than it had been before. This one had left it incomprehensible. For 25 years, she had not made a single significant decision without Edmund somewhere in the thinking of it. The land was still there. The work was still there. But the person she had learned to do both alongside was gone, and she had not yet discovered what kind of woman she was without him. She was beginning to suspect the answer had something to do with the field below the house. She just did not know it yet. The debt notice arrived on the 4th day after the burial. A young man from town brought it on horseback, handed it to Ruth without meeting her eyes, and rode away before she had finished reading it. She stood at the door and unfolded the paper in the gray morning light. The handwriting was formal and unhurried. The The signature at the bottom belonged to Vernon Cade, owner of the general store and operator of the only credit ledger in Bitterroot Flats. The amount was $42.50. Ruth knew the number. Edmund had borrowed against a dry summer 3 years back when the shallow well had given out entirely and they had needed to purchase water through August. He had been paying the balance down steadily whenever the harvest allowed. The remainder was not a large sum by some measures. But in the economy of the valley where most families operated on the thinnest possible margin, it was enough to matter. The notice gave her 45 days to satisfy the balance or demonstrate that the claim remained productive. If she could do neither, the land would be placed before the territorial board and almost certainly sold for a fraction of its value. She read the number twice. Then she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She did not cry. She had cried enough in the days since Edmund died, and there were no tears left for paperwork. The wind came across the prairie and moved through the dry grass along the fence line with a sound like distant breathing. Ruth stood at the door for a long moment, looking out at the land. Then she went inside and put the kettle on. Vernon Cade arrived in his wagon the following week. He came on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the color of old pewter and the wind had a bite in it that suggested the season was already beginning to turn. Ruth heard the wagon on the road before she saw it. She was standing on the porch with her hands folded when he pulled up and set the brake. He was a tall man, Vernon Cade, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements, with a face that had been arranged by years of careful transaction into something that could pass for friendly at a distance. He wore a good coat and a clean hat. He removed the hat as he approached the porch, which Ruth recognized as a performance rather than a courtesy. He began with condolences. He said Edmund had been a solid man and that the valley would be poorer for his absence. He said these things in the tone of someone who had prepared them in advance evenly and without emphasis, and Ruth listened without expression. Then he got to the point. He said he understood her situation. He said a widow alone on a claim in Dakota Territory faced difficulties that most people could not fully appreciate, and that it would be a shame to see a good piece of land fall into the hands of a board that did not understand its value. He was prepared to be generous. He would clear the debt entirely. He would pay her a sum above and beyond that for the transfer of the deed. He would arrange for her to have work in town, something appropriate to her years and her abilities. All she had to do was sign. He had tried to buy this claim from Edmund twice in the past 10 years. Edmund had refused both times quietly, but without ambiguity, and Vernon had gone away without argument, waiting for whatever it was he was willing to wait for. Now Edmund was in the ground, and Vernon had come back with his good coat and his prepared words, and Ruth understood the arithmetic of it very clearly. She looked at Brindle, who had come to sit at the top of the porch steps. The dog was watching Vernon with an attention that was entirely still. She looked beyond Vernon to the cottonwood at the edge of the property, visible from the porch, its pale trunk holding the gray light. "My husband is buried here," she said. Vernon turned his hat in his hands. He said not unkindly, but without any pretense, that graves did not settle store debts. Ruth said nothing. She stepped back inside the cabin and closed the door. She heard his boots on the steps, heard him pause, heard his footsteps crossing the yard, heard the slow turn of wheels on dry ground. Brindle's low growl continued for a few seconds after the wagon was gone. For the first time since receiving the debt notice, Vernon Cade had showed himself plainly. Not a helpful neighbor, not a generous businessman. Something simpler and considerably less patient. That clarity was in its own way useful. That evening, Ruth sat at the table with the lamp burning and Edmund's ordinary papers spread before her. She had been through them already in the raw first days after his death, looking for any resource she might have missed. She had found nothing significant. She did not expect to find anything tonight, but the habit of looking was stronger than the expectation, and she worked through them again. What she was actually searching for was a box of iron nails Edmund had set aside during the summer. She had a loose board on the south wall that needed to be secured before winter, and she remembered him mentioning the nails without being able to recall exactly where he had put them. She thought they might be under the floorboard near the back corner, where he sometimes stored small things he wanted kept dry. She crossed to the corner and was about to kneel down when Brindle moved. The dog had been lying in his usual place beside the stove, his heavy brown body radiating warmth in the small room. He rose, walked to a different floorboard, the one immediately beside the base of the stove, and began scratching at it steadily with his front paw. Not frantic, not urgent. Methodical, the way he did everything with the complete focus of an animal that had decided something needed attention. Ruth called his name. He glanced at her, then returned to scratching. She stood and watched him for a moment. Then she crossed the room and knelt beside him. The board was not obviously different from the others. Same width, same weathered color laid in the same direction. But when she ran her fingers along its edge, the gap on one side was slightly wider than it should have been. When she worked her fingers under the edge and pulled upward, the board came free without resistance. No nails held it. It had simply been set in place, lifted and replaced so many times that the edges had worn smooth. Beneath it lay a darkness that was not empty. Ruth reached in and touched something wrapped in canvas. She pulled it out and set it on the floor, reached in again and found a second bundle, then a third. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she had retrieved, a small wooden chest, no longer than her forearm, bound with leather at each end. The canvas wrapping was still supple with oil attended to recently, or at least not long ago. A leather notebook, its cover worn smooth from many hands. A collection of papers tied together with cord, and a length of rope with knots tied at measured intervals. Brindle sat down beside her and watched. She opened the chest first. The hinges moved without resistance. Inside, arranged against a lining of dry cloth, lay 6 small bags drawn tight with cord. Ruth loosened one and poured a small amount of its contents into her palm. Seeds. Dark red, almost black, with a surface that caught the lamplight with a faint sheen. She had never seen seed corn that color. It was the color of dried blood, the color of rust on old iron, the color of something that had been through fire and come out the other side. Each kernel was slightly irregular in shape, denser than ordinary corn, with a weight in the palm that seemed disproportionate to its size. She closed her hand around them. Then she set them carefully aside and picked up the leather notebook. Edmund's initials were pressed into the lower right corner of the cover. She had not known he owned a notebook like this. She opened it to the first page. His handwriting was there. The familiar slant of it, the careful pressure he always applied, as though each letter deserved to be placed rather than simply made. 2 lines on the first page. Black ember corn. Below it, they will call it cursed because they remember the wrong part of the old story. Ruth sat with the notebook open in her lap, and she read. She read for a long time. The notebook was nearly full. Edmund had been keeping it for years, adding to it, whenever he had something worth recording, which appeared to have been often. Pages of rainfall measurements annotated with observations about how the soil responded at different depths. Diagrams drawn in his careful hand showing the arrangement of plants relative to one another. The angles of water channels cut into the earth. the placement of barriers along field edges. Notes about wood ash, about the moisture-retaining qualities of straw between rows, about the function of bean roots in soil that had been asked to give too much for too long. The seeds were not simply a variety of corn. She understood that clearly after the first dozen pages. They were the centerpiece of a system, a method of planting that worked with the structure of the land, rather than against it, that distributed labor between species, rather than demanding everything from one. The corn grew tall and provided structure. Beans climbed beside it and restored something to depleted soil. Squash spread low across the surface, creating shade, holding moisture, slowing the wind from carrying away what little rain the sky occasionally offered. A phrase appeared twice in different sections of the notebook, underlined both times. Do not plant it like corn. Plant it like a shelter. Ruth understood those words before she finished reading the sentence. 25 years of walking this specific piece of Dakota ground had given her a precise and physical knowledge of its behavior. She knew which sections held water after rain. She knew where the soil was deep and where it was thin above hard pan. She knew which direction the killing winds came from and how long the frost lingered in the low places. She knew as she read Edmund's notes that what he had been describing was not a theory. It was a solution to problems she had been observing for decades, described with a precision she recognized, because the land he was writing about was the same land she had been reading for 25 years with her own eyes and hands. Toward the end of the notebook, she found a map. 7 acres below the house near the old well where the ground stayed dark after rain. Measurements of depth and slope. Notes about shallow channels that could be cut to guide water rather than let it run away. A diagram showing where a strip of bare earth should be maintained along the field's southern edge with a note she did not yet fully understand fire behavior. Spring winds. Keep clear. She closed the notebook. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with that low sound it always made at night, the voice of the place, inseparable from sleep and work in ordinary days. Brindle was warm against her leg. She looked at the seeds in their small bags arranged on the floor in the lamplight. Edmund had kept this chest under the floor for years, adding to the notebook in evenings while she was busy with other things, measuring and recording and planning something he had apparently not yet been ready to show her. She wondered whether he had known in some part of himself that he might not be there when the time came. She reached for the lamp and turned it down. In the morning, she put the seeds back in the chest and wrapped it. She did not return it under the floor. She set it on the shelf above the window where she could see it. The days that followed were ordinary in their outward shape. She fed the animals. She brought water from the well. She repaired a section of fencing that had come loose along the north side. She made bread. She did the 100 small tasks the claim demanded from its keeper, regardless of grief or debt or fear, because the land did not pause for any of those things, and neither could the person responsible for it. But in the evenings, she returned to the notebook. She began to understand it more completely with each reading. The measurements made more sense in light of what she knew about the land they described. The diagrams became less abstract as she matched them against terrain she had been walking for 25 years. She began to see how the pieces connected, how each element supported the others, how the failure of one would compromise the rest. She thought often about the phrase on the first page. They will call it cursed because they remember the wrong part of the old story. She needed to know what the old story was. And she thought she knew one person who might be able to tell her. Winifred Pickett lived at the western edge of the settled part of the valley, where the land began to rise toward the hills. She was 76 years old, lean and upright, with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her neck, and hands that moved with the economy of someone who had never wasted a gesture in her life. She had come to the valley before Ruth and Edmund, before most people following a mission station that had since been abandoned and converted to other uses. She had stayed. Among the things she had kept from her years at that station was a small leather ledger in which she had recorded over many seasons the names and characteristics of every variety of seed that had passed through those doors. It was not a famous document or an official one. It was the careful record of a woman who had understood early that such information was too important to exist only in memory. Ruth had known her for 25 years, enough to know her judgment was worth seeking. She rode out on a Thursday morning, carrying a small cloth bag with a handful of black ember seeds inside. Winifred opened the door before Ruth had finished tying the horse. She looked at the bag in Ruth's hand as she came up the path, and something moved through her expression before Ruth had spoken a word. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to recognition arriving ahead of schedule. She held out her hand. Ruth placed the bag in it. Winifred loosened the cord and poured a few seeds into her palm. She brought them close to her face and turned them slowly in the light. She pressed one gently between her fingers. She was completely quiet. Then she looked up. She had seen these before, she said. Many years ago, when the valley had no more than a handful of families. One family had planted this variety during a season of locusts and drought and a fever that moved through the settlements in summer. By the following spring, most of that family was gone. The crop had become part of the story, and over the years, people had stopped distinguishing between the disaster and the seed that had been present during it. Fear had a way of simplifying things. It gathered everything terrible that happened in one place and pressed it into one object, one name, one warning, and it passed that warning down through the years without any of the context that might have explained it. She handed the seeds back to Ruth. Those people had not failed because of the seed, she said. They had failed because they planted it the wrong way in bad season, in ground already exhausted without the companion plants that the method required. The seed had been blamed because it was unusual, because it was different from what people recognized, because it made an easy target for grief, looking for something to hold responsible. Ruth asked how she knew all of this. Winifred was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Edmund had asked her the same question, on a morning very much like this one. Edmund had come to her years ago with the same seeds in the same kind of bag. She had told him what she had just told Ruth, and he had listened carefully and asked her where the knowledge behind the planting method had originally come from. She had told him then what she would tell Ruth now. There had been a woman many years before Winifred's own time in the valley connected to the mission in its earliest days. She was one of the people who had worked and hunted and farmed the Dakota Plains since long before any settler had broken its soil, since before anyone could remember the beginning of it. She had carried the knowledge the way all true knowledge was carried, in that part of the world, not in books or documents, but in the body and the memory passed from hand to hand through generations of people who understood that survival was a practice, not a theory. The planting method she had taught was old in the way of things tested by centuries of hard ground and uncertain sky. 3 crops together, working in relationship rather than in competition. The tall plant for structure and shelter. The climbing plant to return life to soil that had been asked to give too much for too long. The spreading plant to keep the ground cool and covered, to slow the loss of moisture that was always on the plains, the difference between a harvest and a failure. The woman who had taught it had not described it as a planting method. She had described it as an act of giving back. You did not take from the ground indefinitely. You arranged things so that the taking and the giving happened together in the same season, in the same rows, inseparable from each other, the way breathing in and breathing out were inseparable. Winifred paused. She said that what had been passed down alongside the knowledge itself was a single line. The last thing the old woman had told her student, meant to be carried forward with the seeds and repeated whenever the seeds were passed on. Give to the earth before you ask. The earth does not forget a debt. Ruth sat with the words in the silence of Winifred's small house. She thought about Edmund sitting in this same room, asking the same questions. She thought about the notebook under the floor. She thought about 15 years of rainfall records and measurements and diagrams drawn in lamplight, all of it building towards something he had not lived to complete. She asked Winifred directly whether she believed the method could work. Winifred looked at her steadily and said that Edmund had believed it. She said Edmund had been the most careful observer of land she had encountered in all her years in the valley, and that his belief in a thing was not arrived at easily or let go lightly. She said she had watched him test and revise his understanding of those seeds over many seasons. Then she said something else. She said Ruth had been walking that specific piece of ground for 25 years. She said the notebook was Edmund's document, and the knowledge behind it was older than either of them, but the land itself, those 7 acres below the house, where the ground stayed dark after rain, that land was Ruth's in a way only long acquaintance could make a place yours. She said you already know whether it will work. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she stood, thanked Winifred, and walked back to her horse. She sold the wedding shawl on a Saturday. It was the only thing she owned that could be quickly converted into the items she needed. A new hoe blade, a coil of rope, several small bags of bean seed. The shawl had been a gift from Edmund on their wedding day, embroidered with small flowers in a pattern that had taken someone a long time to make. She had worn it 4 times in her life and kept it folded in a cedar chest between occasions. It was the most obviously valuable thing she owned that was not also a tool or an animal. She did not hesitate over the decision. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to walk from the cabin to the cedar chest. Then she made it. The following Monday, she carried the first seeds out to the field below the house. The 7 acres Edmund had marked in the notebook lay on a slight slope running down toward the old well. The soil there was darker than anywhere else on the claim, with a quality that held on to moisture in the days after rain, when the rest of the ground was already drying. Ruth had noticed this for years without fully understanding why. Edmund's notes explained it. The slight depression in the landscape, the way the water table ran beneath, the composition of soil in that section from decades of plant matter accumulating in the low place. She began with the furrows. She worked slowly, which was not a concession to age, but a deliberate choice. The notebook specified depths and spacings that demanded precision, and precision required patience. She opened each row according to Edmund's measurements, checked her work against the knotted cord she carried in her coat pocket, and moved on only when she was satisfied. The seeds went in at the intervals she had memorized from the diagram. Bean seeds followed at the base of each corn planting. She noted the positions for the squash, which would be added once the first shoots gave her something to orient by. After the seeds came the ash. She had saved wood ash all winter in a clay pot behind the stove, the way the notebook had instructed, and she distributed it now in a thin layer around each planting, working it lightly into the soil. Then came the straw cut from the previous season's fodder pile and laid between rows in a covering that would hold the spring moisture against the inevitable pressure of the Dakota sun. Brindle walked beside her as she worked nose, following the ground at each new furrow, pausing at intervals with the attentive stillness of an animal, committing something to memory. At the end of the last row, he sat down near the cabin-side fence, from where he could watch the full length of the field and the road beyond it. And he remained there through the rest of the afternoon, with his chin resting on his front paws. Wagons slowed on the road as she worked. She heard them without looking up. She was aware of the attention, aware of what it meant, and she set it aside. The work in front of her was concrete and specific, and entirely within her control, and she kept her attention on it. It took 3 days to finish the planting. On the evening of the third day, she walked the field from end to end, checking the coverage of the straw, the alignment of the rows, the placement of the small stones she had used to mark the water channel entrances. The field looked ordinary in the fading light. A stretch of covered ground not noticeably different from any other recently planted section of Dakota soil. Nothing visible yet. Nothing that would tell a passing stranger what lay beneath. But Ruth knew what was there. She knew it the way she knew the sound the well made in July, when the water level was dropping. The way she knew which corner of the cabin to check first after a bad wind. The way she knew the exact moment each morning when the light shifted from gray to gold and the prairie became briefly startlingly beautiful. She knew it the way you know a thing when you have lived beside it long enough that your understanding has moved out of your head and into your hands. The rumors started before the field had been finished a week. She heard them indirectly, the way you always heard such things in a small valley, through pauses in conversations that resumed when she arrived somewhere, through expressions that lingered a moment too long before people looked away. She heard the phrase Vernon Cade had apparently found useful, the widow's ash. She heard that people were saying the dark seed had been connected to an old disaster, that it had poisoned ground before, and would do so again, that whatever Edmund had been thinking, a woman alone at 63 could not see it through. She heard that people were saying she was grieving in a way that had gotten tangled up with hoping, and that the two together were a kind of madness. Reverend Jonas Cray came to the claim on a Wednesday afternoon. He was a decent man. Ruth believed careful and conscientious. He said that people were unsettled. He said the valley had buried too many hopes already, and that another failure would be difficult for families already stretched thin. He said he was not there to make demands, only to convey what he was hearing. Ruth listened to him fully. Then she went inside and came back with Edmund's notebook. She held it out toward him, open to one of the measurement pages, dense with careful handwriting. She said he measured rain, Reverend, not omens. The minister looked at the page for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not quite agreement and not quite reassurance, but was more honest than either. He thanked her for her time. He left. Ruth watched him go. Then she turned and looked at the field. Nothing showed yet above the straw-covered soil. No proof, no vindication. Nothing visible to answer the rumors or justify the $42.50 still owed to Vernon Cade. Just a stretch of ground in the early spring light in the middle of a valley that had learned to expect disappointment and had sometimes been right. Ruth put the notebook back inside. She picked up the hoe. She went back to work. 12 days after planting, the first shoots broke through the soil. Ruth was at the eastern end of the field when she saw them checking the straw coverage along a section that had felt too thin under her hands the previous afternoon. She had been working from west to east, kneeling at intervals to press her palm against the ground, gauging the moisture beneath the mulch. She was halfway down the row when she noticed something had lifted the straw, slightly pushed it from below, with the quiet insistence of a living thing arriving. She knelt and moved the straw aside with 2 fingers. The shoot was small, no taller than the length of her thumb, but it was unmistakably there. Pale at the base where it had worked through the dark soil, then deepening as it rose into the morning air, running through a color that had no simple name. Not red, not purple, not brown. Something between all three, the color of iron left in rain, until the rust runs deep, the color of old blood dried on fabric. A thin vein traced the center of each leaf, branching outward to the edges in a pattern that was almost too precise to seem accidental. She sat back on her heels and looked at the row. More of them. In both directions from where she knelt, the straw was lifting in small, irregular mounds all the way down the line. They had come up overnight, or perhaps over 2 nights without her noticing, and now the entire row showed signs of emergence. She moved along it slowly, checking each shoot, noting which ones stood straight and which bent slightly under the weight of the straw above them. She adjusted the covering where it was too heavy. She left it where it was doing its work. By mid-morning, she had walked all 7 rows. Every planting had produced shoots. The germination rate was higher than she had dared to expect from seeds stored as long as these had been. The bean seedlings were beginning to emerge beside the corn, smaller and greener, pushing up through the looser soil between the furrows. The squash plantings laid in on the 3rd day were still quiet beneath the surface, but she could feel them coming in the slight change in the soil's resistance when she pressed against it. She took her small measuring probe from her coat pocket and checked the moisture depth. 6 inches below the straw surface, the soil was still cool and damp. 6 inches away from the mulched zone where the ground was exposed along the fence line, the top inch of soil was already dry under the morning sun. She opened Edmund's notebook to the observations page and added a line. 12 days post-planting. All rows showing emergence. Moisture held to depth under cover. Exposed border already drying. Then she sat on the fence rail and looked at the field for a while. It was beautiful in a way she had not expected. Not the beauty of a lush field. Not the green abundance that made a good year obvious from a distance. Something quieter and more specific. The red-veined shoots catching the early light, the straw between rows holding its color against the spring sky. The small evidence of roots working downward into soil she had been watching for 25 years. It looked like the beginning of something. Not a guarantee, a beginning. Brindle came from behind the cabin and walked the length of the field without stopping. He did not settle at the fence. He moved instead to the northern end where the bean rows were tallest and lay down facing the road with his chin on his paws. He had been doing this every morning for a week. Ruth had stopped wondering why. It was on a Friday morning, roughly a week after the shoots emerged, that Nell Sproul passed on the wagon road with her 2 children. The younger one, a boy no more than 5 years old, was sitting on the forward edge of the seat, and as the wagon slowed on the slight rise that gave a clear view across Ruth's field, the child stared for several seconds with the absolute focus that small children brought to things they could not explain. Then he pulled at his mother's sleeve and asked why the woman's corn was bleeding. Ruth was near enough to the road to hear the question. She did not hear Nell's answer because there was no answer to hear. The wagon kept moving. Nell's face turned briefly toward Ruth, and then away carried an expression that was not unkind, but was not comfortable either. The look of someone navigating between pity and unease and the ordinary pressure of a morning's errands. The question stayed in the air long after the wagon had gone. She had not thought about how the shoots would look from the road. She had been inside the knowledge of them, measuring their moisture and their growth rates and their alignment with Edmund's diagrams, and she had not stepped back far enough to see what a stranger would see. A widow's field planted in something dark and unfamiliar. Corn that looked like it was bleeding. She understood standing there that no amount of explaining was going to change that first impression for most people. The explanation required knowledge they did not have, and patience they were not going to give. Fear did not require the same patience. Fear was efficient and fast, and it moved through a valley the way water moved downhill, following the path of least resistance, gathering momentum. She went back to work. June arrived with a disposition Ruth recognized. The sky in those first weeks carried clouds that looked like rain and never delivered it, moving in from the west with all the appearance of intention, and then dissolving before reaching the valley. She had seen this before in 3 or 4 of the harder years she and Edmund had weathered together. It was a specific cruelty of the Dakota climate, the way it could withhold without appearing to the way hope was manufactured and canceled in the same afternoon sky. By the second week of June, the grass along the road had gone from pale green to pale yellow. The exposed soil on Hiram Norris's property, which bordered Ruth's claim to the north, had begun to show cracks along the low sections. She could see them from her fence line, the fine network of fractures spreading through the surface of ground that had been plowed bare and left without cover to defend it. Hiram's wheat stood about knee-height, thinner than it should have been, and the color was wrong. Not the yellow of ripening, but the yellow of stress of a plant pulling its resources inward, preparing for difficulty. In town, the conversations at Vernon Cade's general store had changed register. People had stopped talking about the season's prospects and started talking about its limits. The price of flour had moved upward in small increments, each one announced, with an expression of regret so practiced it had become invisible. Seed grain was becoming harder to source. Vernon was careful with his assessments, always framing scarcity as something happening out there in the larger world, never as something he was managing to his own advantage. But Ruth had watched him operate for 25 years, and she understood the shape of what he was doing. On her own field, the drought made itself known without apology. By midday, the black ember leaves drooped under the force of the heat. The same thing happened on every crop in the valley. That was not the difference. The difference came in the late afternoon when the sun began to ease and the temperature dropped by 5 or 10 degrees. Across most of the valley, crops that had wilted in the heat stayed wilted or recovered slowly and incompletely. On Ruth's field, the recovery was faster. Not dramatic, not obviously miraculous, but measurable. She observed it each evening from the field's edge, comparing what she saw with the notation in Edmund's notebook about the role of covered soil in moderating temperature. The ground beneath the straw stayed several degrees cooler than the exposed earth around it. The squash leaves now spreading across the surface between the corn rows created additional shade that the notebook had predicted would matter precisely in conditions like these. She measured. Every other day she used Edmund's probe and the knotted cord to check moisture and root depth at different points across the field. The numbers went into the notebook alongside the weather observations she had been adding since the first week of planting. Then she found the problem. It was the east-facing rows, the ones that received the first direct sun in the morning and therefore dried faster than the rest. The corn there was slightly shorter, slightly less vigorous in its color, and when she checked the straw coverage, she found that the prevailing wind, coming consistently from the southwest, had thinned it. Over the weeks since planting, the wind had been doing its quiet work every day, nudging the straw a fraction toward the northeast, stealing the coverage from the rows that needed it most. She dug up 2 plants from that section and compared them with 2 from the western rows that had performed better. The roots told the story clearly. The struggling eastern plants had reached about 18 inches downward, adequate in a normal year, but not deep enough to access the moisture that persisted in the subsoil after the surface layers had dried out. The stronger western plants had roots that passed 31 inches, breaking through the layer of compacted earth that stopped most ordinary corn varieties from going any deeper. The difference was not the seed. The difference was the coverage that had been protecting the moisture those deeper roots needed to reach. She spent 2 full days repairing the eastern section. More straw packed tighter against the wind direction. Small barriers of loose stone along the windward edge to break the flow before it reached the rows. Additional soil mounded at the base of each plant. She worked without assistance, and she worked carefully, because in a situation this specific carelessness was the same as failure. Then she waited. 12 days after the repair, she measured again. The eastern plants had recovered. Not fully, not to the level of the western section, but the improvement was real and measurable, and the root depth on 2 replanted indicators had already increased by 7 inches. She wrote the numbers in the notebook. The first failure cycle was complete. The field was not saved by it. It was simply still alive. Meanwhile, the conversations behind her back were becoming louder. A meeting of some kind had been held at the church one evening. Not a formal meeting, more of a gathering of people with shared concerns. The kind of gathering that in a small valley carried more authority than any official assembly, because it required no record and no accountability. The concerns, as best as she could understand them from indirect accounts, centered on the idea that the unusual crop was drawing water from underground sources shared with neighboring properties, that the red roots were reaching into channels that fed the community well, that whatever was growing in Ruth Calloway's field was not growing naturally. She knew the accusations were not based on any measurement or evidence of any kind. Edmund had spent considerable time studying the drainage patterns of the valley and had recorded his findings in one of the earlier sections of the notebook. The water table beneath her field had no connection to the community well, which sat on different ground and different geology. She knew this from 25 years of direct observation and from Edmund's careful documentation of the valley's underground behavior. But knowing a thing was wrong and demonstrating it to people who did not want to be convinced were 2 entirely different problems. Reverend Jonas Cray came on a Tuesday afternoon with Marshall Wade Briggs beside him, the 2 of them walking the road to her gate in the way of men carrying an unpleasant errand they wished were someone else's. The Reverend looked tired. The Marshal looked carefully neutral. They had no official order. The Reverend explained this at the outset with a directness Ruth appreciated, even as she understood it to be a kind of warning. He said that community anxiety had reached a point where something needed to be addressed. He said there were families genuinely frightened, and that fear, however unfounded, had a way of becoming its own kind of problem if it was not met with something tangible. Ruth did not argue with them. She did not list the reasons their concerns were scientifically unsupported. She had learned over 63 years of dealing with people that the most effective response to doubt was not argument, it was demonstration. She walked to the eastern edge of her field and bent down. She pressed her hand into the soil beneath the straw cover and came up with a fistful of dark earth that held its shape. When she squeezed it damp and dense and alive with the smell of working soil. Then she walked 10 steps to the fence line where the ground was bare. She bent again and came up with another handful. She walked back and held both hands out side by side. The difference was immediate and absolute. The covered soil from her field held its shape, a dense clump that the moisture bound together. The bare earth from beyond the fence fell apart as she opened her fingers, running through the gaps like dry powder, leaving nothing but dust on her palm. She did not explain the demonstration. She let it sit between the 3 of them in the afternoon light. The Marshal looked at her hands for a long time. The Reverend looked at them too. Something shifted in the Reverend's expression that was not yet acceptance, but was at least the beginning of the distance required for honest thinking. She said quietly that the ground she was standing on was doing what ground could do, when it was treated properly. She said it was not stealing water from anyone. It was holding what little rain the sky had offered and refusing to let it run away or evaporate. She said her husband had spent 15 years understanding how to do that on this specific piece of land, and she intended to finish what he had started. The marshal nodded once. The Reverend said he would report what he had observed. He thanked her for her time. Ruth watched them walk back down the road toward town. Then she turned and looked at the field, and she saw exactly what they had seen from the road. The red veined leaves in the afternoon sun, the straw between rows, the slight formal strangeness of a field planted by a method no one in the valley recognized. She understood that the demonstration had not resolved anything. The fear would find new shapes. It always did. She went inside and made her supper. The fire came on the third night of the hot wind. It had been building for days, not in sudden eruption, but in a gradual accumulation of conditions that made the eventual event almost inevitable. The wind had come out of the southwest, 3 days running hot and dry and constant, the kind of wind that stripped the moisture from everything it touched and left the valley feeling papery and taut. The grass along the road was the color of straw. The brush on the south side of the property had gone from green to brown in 2 weeks. Ruth had been aware of the risk. Edmund's notebook mentioned it in that section, near the end, with the diagram and the note she had puzzled over in the early days. Fire behavior, spring winds, keep clear. She had maintained the 3-foot strip of bare earth along the southern edge of the field as the notebook specified, scraping it clear of dead vegetation once a week, keeping it down to raw soil. She had not fully understood why until the third night of the hot wind. She woke before she knew what had woken her. Brindle was no longer on the floor beside the bed. That was the first thing she registered. Then the sound, a low crackling from the south that the wind was carrying toward the cabin. She was out of bed and at the door before the smell reached her. She came outside into a darkness lit from the south. Fire was moving through the dead brush along the southern boundary of the property. 20 or 30 feet of flame front advancing with the wind behind it. It had started somewhere in the brush beyond her fence line, and it was moving fast. She ran for the water bucket beside the porch and crossed the yard toward the field, calculating as she went. She could not stop this with a bucket. The fire front was too wide and too fast for one person to outpace. She understood this in the time it took her to cross the yard, and she stopped and stood still for a moment in the firelight, watching the flame advance toward the southern edge of the field. Then the fire reached the bare strip. She watched it happen in real time. The flame front hit the 3-foot width of scraped bare earth and faltered. It did not go out immediately. It pushed forward, found the edge of the straw covering beyond the bare strip, caught a few of the outer squash leaves, and burned 6 inches into the field's southern margin. But without the continuous fuel that the bare strip had interrupted, the front lost its coherence. It spread sideways along the boundary rather than advancing inward, and as it moved away from the wind-driven center, it weakened further until it was burning in the hesitant, directionless way of a fire that has run out of what it needs. Ruth stood with the useless bucket in her hand and watched the bare strip do what Edmund had planned for it to do. He had put it there for fire, not as a border or a marker. He had studied the wind patterns of this valley for 25 years, the same years she had been watching them without formally documenting them, and he had understood that the southern exposure in a hot, dry summer was a fire risk. And he had built a defense against it into the design of the field before he was ever healthy enough to plant the field. She had dug that strip without knowing why. She understood it now, completely and all at once, standing in the firelight with the empty bucket in her hand. The field had not survived because of luck. It had survived because a methodical and deliberate man had thought through every threat this specific piece of ground would face, and had quietly prepared for it, and had trusted that someone who knew the land as well as he did would follow his instructions even without knowing exactly why. Brindle was barking from somewhere near the fence line, sharp and insistent. Not the random bark of a startled animal, but the focused alert of a dog who had found something specific. She crossed toward him, with the lamp she had gone back inside to retrieve, and found him standing at the far western edge of the bare strip, barking at the ground. There were footprints in the soft soil. 2 sets approaching from the brush beyond the fence, and retreating the same way, the retreat more hurried than the approach. And at the base of the nearest fence post, a piece of cloth that smelled strongly of lamp oil. Marshal Briggs arrived 20 minutes later, following the glow from the road. He stood and looked at the cloth and the footprints in the lamplight without saying anything for a long time. Then he said he would make inquiries. Nobody was charged. No one admitted to anything in the days that followed. The fire had done limited damage. Some outer squash vines, a handful of scorched leaves at the southern margin. The 7 acres of black ember and beans and spreading squash had survived because of a 3-foot strip of bare earth that a quiet man had spent his last healthy year arranging. Vernon Cade heard about the fire and said in the hearing of several people at his store that if the crop could stop fire, then it probably proved it was not natural. He said it with a small smile, the expression of a man adding another stone to a wall he was building. Winifred Pickett came to the field 2 days after the fire, arriving in the early morning with a short shovel and a glass jar. She walked the southern margin, first examining the damage and the line where the fire had stopped. Then she came to the undamaged interior rows and dug carefully, taking a plant from the damaged margin and a plant from the healthy center, and laying them side by side on the bare soil, their root systems exposed to the morning air. The difference was not subtle. The damaged margin plant had shallow roots, weakened by its position at the edge of the system's protection, its development arrested by conditions the interior plants had been sheltered from. The interior plant's root system reached downward nearly 46 inches thinner than ordinary corn roots, but far longer, penetrating layers of compacted earth that most varieties never reached. Along the bean roots, the nitrogen nodules that were doing quiet chemistry in the soil returning to the ground, something of what the previous decade of hard planting had stripped out. Winifred filled her glass jar with soil from the field, and a second sample from the bare ground beyond the fence. She held both jars up to the morning light. The field soil settled in the water differently slower, holding more matter in suspension, the color of the water darker, with organic content. The outside soil settled almost immediately, the water clearing quickly, leaving a thin layer of mineral at the bottom and almost nothing else. She looked at the jar for a long time. Then she said that the field was not stealing water from Bitterroot Flats. It was teaching dead ground how to hold what little heaven gives it. Ruth was standing beside her. She took Edmund's notebook from her coat and opened it to the notes page at the back, where she had been adding her own observations since the beginning. She wrote the sentence down in the margin. It was the first confirmation she had received that was not her own measurement or her own reading of Edmund's records. It was not applause. It was not the kind of vindication that would change minds in town. It was just an honest statement from an honest woman who had looked at the evidence and described what she saw. It was enough. By the last week of July, the difference between Ruth's field and the surrounding valley had become visible from the road, not obvious in the way of abundance. The black ember was not the tallest crop in Bitterroot Flats, not the greenest or the most dramatic, but it was upright when other crops were bent. Its leaves held color when neighboring fields had gone the yellow of exhaustion. The beans were climbing the corn stalks exactly as Edmund had predicted, and the squash had spread across most of the ground surface between rows, creating a low, living canopy that the sun could not easily penetrate. Vernon Cade noticed. He had been watching the field since the first day of planting, and he had watched it with increasing attention as the season became harder and the crops around it became more obviously stressed. He was a man who understood value in concrete and immediate terms, and what he was watching develop in Ruth Calloway's 7 acres was a value that threatened the structure of control he had built in the valley over the preceding decade. If the seed survived the drought and produced a real harvest, people would begin asking about it. If people began asking about it and Ruth provided what they asked for, the absolute dependence on his warehouse grain would be weakened. Not eliminated, but weakened enough to matter. He came back to the claim on a Thursday afternoon in early August. This time, there was no performance of sympathy. He did not remove his hat at the gate. He came directly to the porch where Ruth was sitting with her mending and stood at the bottom step and made his offer plainly. He would clear the debt. Every cent of the $42.50 canceled. In addition, a milk cow, good quality. Ruth could continue living in the cabin through winter and through the following spring without any claim on the property. All he needed was the black ember seed, every bag from every storage location, Edmund's notebook, and the exclusive right to distribute the variety through his store to the families of the valley. Ruth had the needle moving through a grain sack she was reinforcing before he finished speaking. She did not stop it. She said, "Last month you were calling it the widow's ash." Vernon said that names changed when men came to understand the value of a thing. Ruth said nothing for a moment. She completed the stitch she was working on and moved the needle to the next. Brindle rose from under the porch. The dog walked slowly to the top step and stood there looking down at Vernon, not barking, not growling, simply present in the way of a dog that has taken a position and does not intend to leave it. Ruth said, without raising her voice, that Vernon should go. She said he should go before Brindle decided whether he was a guest or a thief, and that the distinction mattered because the dog had a long memory. Vernon looked at the dog. He looked at Ruth. He turned and walked back to his wagon without another word. Ruth watched him go. The visit confirmed something she had been considering carefully since Winifred's assessment of the soil. Vernon was no longer trying to take the land. He was trying to take the knowledge, which meant the land without the knowledge had become less interesting to him than the knowledge without the land. Edmund had understood something worth understanding. She intended to protect it. August deepened, without relief from the heat. And then on the last day of the month, the weather changed in a way that Ruth's body understood before her mind had processed what she was seeing. She was at the well in the early evening when she first noticed it. The sky to the west was the wrong color, not the red and orange of an ordinary sunset, but something flatter and more uniform, a pale light that sat across the horizon without warmth. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the southwest for weeks, dropped away in the late afternoon and then stopped entirely. The valley went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. Brindle would not come inside. She called him twice. He came to the porch, looked at her, and walked back to the field. He paced the length of the southern row and then the northern row, and then stood at the windward corner with his nose testing the air in the direction of that wrong-colored sky. She watched him from the porch for half an hour. He did not settle. She went inside and got Edmund's notebook. She turned to the sections she had not yet fully studied, the later pages toward the back where his writing had become smaller and more compressed, as if he had understood he was running short of space. Notes about temperature extremes, notes about early frost events he had recorded over the years, dates and conditions and patterns. A section about what happened to the crop if frost reached it before the kernels had properly set. And then, near the bottom of a page, a brief entry about protection measures. Not a full method. The beginning of one, the kind of notation meant to be developed later into something complete. She read it twice. Then she went outside. The sky was the flat, pale color of old pewter now, and the temperature had already dropped several degrees from the afternoon's warmth. The damp at the corner of the porch step was beginning to behave the way it behaved, before the hard, cold stiffening, slightly not yet frozen, but moving toward it. She understood that she could not cover 7 acres. She did not have the canvas, or the fabric, or the time. What she had was the method incomplete, as it was the beginning Edmund had left her in the 25 years of watching this specific valley's weather that she brought to the reading of it. She worked through the night. Damp grass, cut from the low spots near the well, laid in low, smoldering piles along the windward edge of the field, 3 piles spaced to cover the length of the southern boundary. The smoke was thin, but it was there drifting over the field in the still air, the warmth of it fractionally raising the temperature above the critical threshold. Willow branches she had been collecting and storing for fence repair, woven quickly into barriers across the low gaps in the windward exposure where cold air would concentrate, and the well. She ran the last water through the channels Edmund had designed, filling the shallow furrows until the water was standing, letting the ground absorb it. Wet soil released stored heat more slowly than dry soil. Edmund had noted this. She had observed it herself in the behavior of the field through the drought months. She worked until just before dawn when she was too tired to work precisely, and tired work was worse than no work. Then she sat on the fence rail and waited for the sun. The frost was visible from the porch before she reached the cabin. A coating of white across the lower-lying sections of the valley, the places where cold air pooled overnight. She stood and looked across Bitterroot Flats in the early light. Hiram Norris's field to the north was white from fence to fence. She could see, even at this distance, the flat, defeated posture of his wheat lying down against the frost-covered ground. Along the road to the south, another family's garden showed the dark, wilted edges of freeze damage. She had seen that exact look before, the black softening of leaves that had been alive and were now not, and she knew what it meant for the season ahead. She turned and looked at her own field. The outer row on the south side showed damage. 4 or 5 squash vines at the exposed margin had collapsed, their leaves hanging dark and brittle. Several corn leaves at the same margin had taken on the color of the freeze injury. She walked to the edge and went in. The interior rows were standing. The corn was there upright in the early light, its color deeper than it had been the day before, the dark red of the leaves intensified by the cold to something almost black in the low morning sun. She touched a leaf. The surface was cold, but the tissue was not destroyed. She bent one of the central stalks gently, and it moved without breaking, which meant the cells were still intact, which meant the plant was still alive. She walked the entire field. The outer margins had suffered. The interior, the bulk of the 7 acres she had planted and tended and repaired and defended through the summer, was intact. She made herself walk to the fence line on the north side and look across at Hiram Norris's field for a long time. Not with satisfaction. She had lived beside that man for 25 years, and she took no pleasure in his loss. She looked because it was important to understand the difference honestly, to see clearly what the method had done and what the absence of it had done, to carry that understanding forward without sentimentality or self-congratulation. She was still standing there when Hiram's wagon appeared on the road. He pulled up at his own gate and sat for a moment looking at the damage in his field. Then he turned and looked at Ruth's. He was a large man, Hiram Norris, physically substantial in the way of men who had done hard outdoor labor for 40 years. And he sat his wagon with the solidity of someone who had occupied his chosen position in the world without serious challenge. He had not spoken to Ruth since before the planting began. He had not been unfriendly. He had been dismissive in the way of someone who had decided a thing was beneath serious consideration and had arranged his days accordingly. He looked at her field for a long time, at the standing corn in the early light, at the frost-damaged but undefeated rows, at the evidence of a night's work that had no drama attached to it, no spectacle, only the ordinary-looking result of doing exactly the right thing at exactly the right time, with exactly the knowledge required. He reached up and removed his hat. He held it at his side for a moment, looking at the field. Then he put it back on and drove away without a word. Ruth stood at the fence line until his wagon was out of sight. She was cold. She had been awake all night. Her hands were dirty from the well water and the smoldering grass piles and the willow branches woven in the dark. She was 63 years old, and she had been on her feet for more hours than she wanted to count, and she was aware of every one of them. She walked back to her field. She went in at the eastern end and walked slowly to the western end, one row at a time, checking each plant, noting the damage and the survival, writing the figures in the notebook she carried in her coat. When she finished, she closed the notebook. The black ember had come through the night, damaged at the margins, alive at the core. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the table until the warmth from the stove reached her hands. Outside, the sun was burning the frost off the lower fields. By mid-morning, the white would be gone, and the evidence of the night would be reduced to the wilted edges of crops that had not been ready for it. What remained in the valley after that would be the inventory of what had survived and what had not. Ruth Calloway's field would be included in that inventory. She understood what that meant. She understood what was coming. She finished her coffee. Then she went back out to the field. There was still work to do. The harvest came in the second week of September, on a stretch of mornings that were cool and bright in the way of early autumn on the Dakota plains, when the air carried just enough cold to feel like a promise, and the light came in at an angle that made ordinary things look considered. Ruth began at the eastern end and worked west. She did not rush. The work of harvesting was not faster for being hurried, and she had learned long ago that the best way to understand what a season had produced was to move through it slowly, to let the evidence accumulate in her hands and her eyes and her memory before she tried to put numbers to it. She cut the corn stalks at the base and laid them in ordered groups across the rows. She gathered the dried bean pods into cloth bags. She moved the squash into the low wooden cart she had used for this kind of work for 20 years, loading each one with the care of someone handling something that had earned its right to be treated carefully. Brindle walked beside her through the morning. She had noticed the change in him through August, the way he settled himself more deliberately than he once had, as if each movement now required a small, private decision. She did not make mention of it to him. He was doing the work he had always done, which was to be present and attentive, and she respected that enough not to treat it as something requiring comment. On the third day, she finished the stalks and began the grain. The counting took 2 full days. She worked at the rough table she had set up in the storage room, running the grain through her hands, checking for damage, separating the compromised kernels from the viable ones. She had expected less. Not failure, she had moved past the possibility of complete failure somewhere in August when the frost came and went and the field stood, but she had been careful with her expectations in the way of someone who had been surprised by bad seasons before and preferred not to be caught off guard. When she finished counting, she had 37 bushels of usable grain. She stood in the storage room and looked at the sacks arranged along the wall and said nothing for a while. 37 bushels from 7 acres in a drought year, following a late frost in soil that had been asked to give without adequate return for longer than it should have been. It was not a number that would impress anyone who had not watched the summer. It was not a harvest that would make a person rich. But it was food. Real food. Measurable and storable and made from a seed that had been called a curse and a poison in the private madness of a grieving widow. She also had the dried stalks. Edmund's notebook had devoted 3 pages to the secondary value of black ember as fodder, noting that the dried material retained nutritional content through winter storage better than most of the common grain varieties grown in the valley. She had read those pages carefully in the early months when the planting was new, and the notes felt more like hope than instruction. Now she had what the notes had described: stacks of dried stalks in the back of the barn that represented real value to families whose livestock were entering the season thin. She made a list. She counted what she could spare and what she needed to keep for seed. She thought about the families she knew in the valley, the ones who were most likely to have exhausted their fodder stores early, the ones with young children or elderly members, or more animals than a bad year could easily feed. She thought about what Edmund's notebook said about the obligation that came with being the keeper of a method rather than merely the owner of a crop. Then she thought about the debt. The debt to Vernon Cade still stood. $42.50, with the 45-day window, now many months past. Vernon had not pressed the legal case since the land agent's visit was pending, but she understood that he was waiting. Men like Vernon Cade were patient in the way of people who had arranged things so that time worked in their favor. She loaded a single sack of black ember grain onto the wagon on a Saturday morning and drove to Emmett Greer's mill at the south end of the valley. She had not announced her intention. There had been no arrangement made, no time specified. She simply arrived at the mill with the sack, and by the time she had unloaded it at the door, there were already 3 people watching from the road. By the time Emmett had the grain weighed and ready to run, and there were closer to 12. They gathered the way people in small places gathered around anything unusual, with a mixture of genuine curiosity and the guardedness of those who had committed themselves to an opinion and were not sure they wanted to revise it in public. Hiram Norris was there. Reverend Jonas Cray stood near the door with his hat in both hands. Nell Sproul had come with her 2 children and stood at the back where she had a clear view of the grinding stones. Vernon Cade was not present, which meant he knew something was happening and had decided that his absence served him better than his presence. Emmett ran the grain through his stones without comment. He was a professional man in the way of people whose work required precision, and he gave his full attention to the task, monitoring the feed rate and the pressure and the temperature of the stones with the focused calm of someone who had done this 10,000 times and understood that the 10,000th time deserved the same attention as the first. The flour began to collect in the tray below the stones. It was the color that people noticed first. Not white, not the pale cream of ordinary milled grain. The flour was a warm, reddish brown, the color of earth after rain, the color of the seeds themselves, translated into something fine and light and soft. It settled in the tray with the quality of good flour, not dusty and dry, but with a slight body to it, a density that caught the light from the mill door in a way that suggested substance. Then the smell reached them. It was not the flat, starchy smell of ordinary cornmeal. It was something warmer and more complex, with a quality that Ruth had no precise word for, but that her body recognized instantly as food. Roasted grain, wood smoke. Something slightly sweet underneath. Not the sweetness of sugar, but the deeper sweetness of a thing that had converted sunlight and water and good soil into energy over a long season. Nobody spoke while the grinding continued. The mill turned. The flour accumulated. Outside, the September light came in through the open door at a low angle and caught the dust that rose from the stones in a way that made the whole interior of the mill seem softened and golden. When Emmett was satisfied, he stopped the stones and stepped back. Winifred Pickett had come while the milling was in progress, arriving without announcement and positioning herself near the door where Ruth could see her. She had brought a small cast iron skillet. Without asking permission, she moved to the open fire that Emmett kept banked at the side of the mill for heating metal and set the skillet on it. She measured flour and water, by eye mixed them in the skillet with a wooden spoon she had in her coat pocket and set the result over the heat. The smell changed again as the batter cooked. It deepened the roasted quality, becoming richer and more immediate. Filling the mill the way the smell of something truly nourishing could fill a space and change the quality of the air in it. Nobody was talking. 12 people standing in a mill watching a small skillet and not saying anything. When Winifred judged the cake cooked, she slid it onto the wooden board Emmett kept near the fire and cut it with a straight edge into pieces. She lifted the first piece and turned toward the room. Her eyes went to Reverend Jonas Cray. The Reverend came forward and took the piece from her. He was a man who understood ceremony, who had spent his adult life in rooms where gestures carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, and he brought the same deliberateness to this moment that he brought to any public act. He held the cake for a moment, then he put it in his mouth and chewed. He chewed slowly. He swallowed. The room was entirely still. "It is food," he said. That was all. Not a proclamation, not a sermon, not the kind of statement that was designed to be remembered. Just 4 words from a man who had spent 8 months watching a community debate whether something was poison, delivered in the plain tone of a person who had expected complexity and found simplicity. The words moved through the room with a force that no elaborate speech could have carried. People looked at each other. Hiram Norris accepted a piece of the cake from Winifred and ate it without any ceremony at all, with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who had decided something and saw no reason to perform the decision. The 2 children with Nell Sproul ate their pieces quickly and held out their hands for more. Ruth stood near the door and watched and said nothing. She had been waiting 9 months for this. Not for approval. She had stopped caring about approval somewhere in the long nights of the summer, when she was checking moisture levels by lamplight and adjusting straw coverage in the early morning cold. She had been waiting for the simpler thing. For the moment when the argument ended, not because anyone had been defeated, but because the evidence had simply become too obvious to talk around. The argument ended in a mill in September, with a piece of warm cornbread and 4 words from a man in a black coat. That evening, she sat at the table with the notebook open to the last used page and wrote the day's observations in her careful hand. Grain quality, flour color, smell and texture of the milled product, germination notes for next season, the quantity she had decided to reserve for seed, the names of the families she intended to approach before winter. She was halfway through the list when she heard a sound from the direction of the barn. She paused her writing. Brindle was asleep under the table. He was not barking, which meant whatever the sound was had not yet reached the threshold that triggered his attention. She sat still and listened. A soft scraping from the direction of the storage shed, where she had moved the grain after the milling. The shed sat about 30 feet from the cabin, close enough to hear on a quiet night, but far enough that its interior was not visible from the cabin windows. She waited. Brindle's eyes opened. He was still lying down, but his ears had moved forward, and the alertness in his body had changed from the loose relaxation of sleep to something focused and ready. He made no sound. He simply lay there, awake and attending. Ruth rose from the table. She moved to the far corner of the cabin, where she kept a lamp turned low on the shelf and lifted it. She did not increase the flame. In the darkness outside, a bright lamp would announce her approach before she was close enough to see anything. She went to the door and opened it quietly. The night was cold and clear, the kind of September night that did not apologize for what was coming. Stars were visible in the gap between the clouds. The shed door was closed as she had left it. Nothing moved in the yard. Then Brindle came past her at a run. He crossed the yard in silence, which was what made it alarming. He was not barking. He was moving with the low, purposeful speed of a dog that had already decided, and he went directly around the back of the shed, out of Ruth's line of sight. She crossed the yard quickly, holding the lamp low. She came around the corner of the shed and stopped. Brindle had his front paws on the fence rail and was barking now into the darkness beyond the property line, the sharp, repetitive bark he used for something specific. On the ground near the shed's back wall, a figure was getting up from the dirt, moving quickly, heading toward the gap in the fence at the far corner of the yard. A second figure was already through the gap and running. The first one made it 3 steps before his foot caught in the drying line Ruth had strung between the corner post and the shed wall 2 weeks earlier. He went down hard and stayed down the impact enough to knock the breath from him. By the time he had recovered enough to try rising, Marshal Wade Briggs had appeared from the direction of the road, moving at a pace that suggested he had been closer than chance would account for. Ruth stood at the corner of the shed and watched. Briggs had the man on his feet and was asking questions in his direct and unhurried way. The man was young, younger than Ruth had expected, and he was clearly frightened, and he answered Briggs's questions with the rapidly shifting quality of someone calculating how much trouble different answers would bring. Ruth looked at the shed door. She had left it locked with the iron bar that Edmund had fitted to it years ago. The bar had been lifted from its bracket and set against the wall. The door was ajar. Whoever had come into the shed had gotten the bar off without the difficulty she would have expected, which meant they had known about the bar, which meant they had been told what to look for. She went inside and picked up the lamp. The large sack she had positioned near the center of the shed was gone. The rest of the storage, the seed jars, and the smaller bags she had arranged according to Edmund's instruction about dispersing seed across multiple locations was untouched. The jars under the loose board in the corner were still there. The 4 bags she had distributed to different points in the property were still where she had placed them. The bag in the barn loft had not been touched. The sack they had taken was the one she had intended them to take. She had made the decision in August, shortly after the fire. Edmund had written in the notebook in the section about storage that a careful person never kept seed in one obvious place, and that a bag of compromised grain in the expected location was a small insurance worth maintaining. She had set a large sack of the damaged grain from the fire-affected margin near the center of the shed, in a position that would be obvious to anyone entering with a lamp. She had left it there through September. She went back outside. Briggs had the man seated on the ground and was writing in his small notebook by the light of his own lamp. Ruth came and stood nearby. Briggs asked his questions, and the young man answered them slowly at first, and then with less resistance as he worked through his private calculation of how much honesty his situation required. He had been paid in flour and in the cancellation of a drinking debt he owed at the general store. He had been told the sack contained viable seed and would be wanted before morning. He had not known about the second man, or claimed not to know. Briggs did not appear to find this credible. Ruth said nothing during this exchange. She listened, She noted the specific terms flour and a drinking debt, the currency of a man who controlled both the supply of the first and the accounting of the second. She noted the timing the night before she was due to make her distribution of seed to the families on her list. She noted that the man who had run was still somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line. Briggs told the young man he would be called upon to repeat what he had said in a more formal setting. The young man did not look pleased about this, but did not object. Briggs looked at Ruth and said he would be making inquiries first thing in the morning. Ruth nodded. She went back inside. She sat at the table for a while with the lamp burning and the notebook open, not writing. Brindle had come back in and settled against the stove with the definitive quality of a dog who had completed a task and considered it satisfactorily done. The sack they had taken was sitting somewhere in the dark between here and town, full of burned and compromised grain that was fit for nothing. The seed she had actually been protecting was safe in 5 separate locations across the property, exactly as Edmund had advised. She had followed his instructions so carefully for so long that they had become her own instincts. She had stopped distinguishing between his knowledge and hers. By sunrise the next morning, the story of the spoiled sack had reached every corner of Bitterroot Flats. The news moved with the speed of things that confirmed what people had already suspected, and the young man's account of who had paid him moved with it. Ruth had said nothing publicly, had drawn no conclusions in any conversation, had made no accusation. She had not needed to. The evidence was sitting in a sack in the middle of town, and the young man had given his account to a marshal who was not in Vernon Cade's debt. For the first time in 8 months, the suspicion that had been directed at Ruth Calloway's field and Ruth Calloway's seed and Ruth Calloway's judgment turned and looked elsewhere. 2 weeks later, Agent Lorne Alcott arrived from the territorial office. He came on a Wednesday morning alone, driving a plain wagon with no ceremony. He was a compact and efficient-looking man in his 50s, with the expression of someone who had been doing a difficult and thankless job long enough to have stripped it of all sentiment. He was polite in the way of someone for whom politeness was a tool rather than a disposition. Vernon Cade had filed a formal objection to the renewal of the Calloway claim, citing the planting methods as reckless and inconsistent with productive use of agricultural land. The objection had been entered into the territorial record and required a response, which was why Alcott was here. He said this to Ruth at the gate plainly and without preamble, and she appreciated the plainness. Vernon was present as well, having apparently been informed of the inspection's timing. He stood near his wagon at the edge of the road with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, and he offered his arguments from that position, maintaining the air of someone who had already made the decisive points and was waiting for the bureaucratic process to confirm them. The methods were not recognized. The variety was not registered. The planting arrangement deviated from established practice. A widow of advanced age operating without proper guidance had made choices that could have consequences beyond her own property. Alcott listened to Vernon's arguments for about 2 minutes. Then he turned to Ruth. She had been ready since the day after the frost. The table inside the cabin held everything she had spent the summer accumulating. Edmund's notebook opened to the first page with the year of the first notation visible. Her own records kept in the plain brown ledger she had been filling since the first day of planting, with every measurement and observation and repair she had made recorded, in her careful hand beside the date and the weather conditions. The soil samples Winifred had preserved in their glass jars still showing the difference in color and density between the field soil and the bare ground beyond the fence. The harvest weights she had recorded herself, verified and signed by Emmett Greer when he milled the grain. The knotted cord with its 22 measuring points each knot, representing a depth she had reached with a probe in the field and recorded in the ledger. And the bags of flour, the warm, reddish-brown meal that smelled of roasted grain in a long season of careful work. She placed each item on the table without commentary. She let Alcott move through them in his own time. He spent 15 minutes with the notebooks. He asked several specific questions about depth of root development, about the fire break maintenance record, about the moisture comparison data from June and July. Ruth answered each question directly with the page reference in the ledger if the numbers were needed. Then she took him out to the field. She walked him in from the eastern end and let him see the whole of it. The cut rows post-harvest showed the root systems of the harvested plants visible at the soil surface where she had lifted the stalks. He crouched and looked at the root structure of several plants. He walked to the southern edge and examined the fire break which she had maintained through the season and which showed clearly the scraping and clearing she had done over the past months. He looked at the water channels shallow and precise, running at the angles Edmund had designed. He pressed his hand into the soil where the squash leaves had provided ground cover all summer, and he noted the difference between that soil and the exposed border at the property line. He walked the entire 7 acres without speaking. When he came back to the gate, he opened his ledger. He wrote for a moment. Then he read what he had written, made one addition, and closed the ledger. Claim active, he said. Crop viable. Soil held. He said it without emphasis in the same tone he had used for everything else. The flat professional tone of a man delivering a factual conclusion. He capped his pen. He nodded to Ruth. He turned and walked to his wagon. The debt notice, the one she had folded into her apron pocket on the 4th morning after Edmund died, had been answered. Not with money. With something harder to dispute than money. A territorial record that said the land was productive and a season that had proved it true in front of a man whose job was to measure such things. Vernon had not moved from the road. He was still standing with his arms folded. He looked at Alcott as the agent walked past him. Alcott did not break stride. He got into his wagon, turned it, and drove south. Vernon stood in the road for a moment. He said nothing. His face was very still in the way of someone managing something with considerable effort. Then he got into his own wagon and drove north toward town. Ruth stood at her gate and watched him go. She thought about the first day he had come to the cabin, the good coat, and the prepared words and the hat removed as a performance. She thought about the fire and the footprints in the soft soil near the fence post. She thought about a young man on the ground in her yard, with his foot caught in a drying line and a sack full of spoiled grain, sitting somewhere in the dark. She thought about $42.50 and a 45-day window that had long since closed, and she understood that the window had now been answered in the only language a territorial board would accept: evidence measurement and the testimony of the land itself. She went inside and added the date and Alcott's conclusion to the last page of her ledger. Then she began preparing for winter. The first hard cold settled over Bitterroot Flats in early November, and within 2 weeks, the conversations in the valley had shifted from what the harvest had been to what the winter would require. There is a specific arithmetic to surviving a Dakota winter on limited stores, and families who had spent August watching drought damage their crops were now sitting at kitchen tables, performing that arithmetic, and not always liking the results. The general store was busy. Flour prices had moved upward in the way they moved when supply was tight and demand was anxious. Each small increase announced with the regret of inevitability. Vernon's shelves remained stocked, which meant he had anticipated the shortfall and prepared for it, which told Ruth something about how early he had understood what kind of season this was going to be and what he had chosen to do with that understanding. Nell Sproul came to the claim on a Tuesday evening in the second week of November. Ruth saw the wagon from the window and watched it come up the track before going to the door. Nell pulled up in the yard and sat for a moment before climbing down. She was a woman in her early 40s, lean and capable looking, with the permanent tiredness of someone who had been managing without adequate help for too long. She came to the porch with her son's cap in her hands, turning it between her fingers in a way she was probably not aware of. She stood on the bottom step and did not immediately speak. Ruth looked at her and waited. Nell said that the roof had let water in again, and her younger child had been sick since October, and the flour bin had about 2 days left in it. She said these things in a flat, practical voice, the voice of someone reporting facts rather than asking for sympathy, and then she stopped and stood there with her son's cap turning in her hands. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. She thought about the months of isolation, the conversations that softened and stopped when she walked through town, the wagon slowing on the road and a child asking why the corn was bleeding, and Nell's face turned briefly toward Ruth and then away. She thought about those things honestly and held them, without letting them close around her like a fist. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. She told Nell to come in out of the cold. She poured coffee. She asked about the sick child, what the symptoms were, and when they had started, and whether anyone had looked at the child properly. She listened to the answers. Then she went to the storage room and came back with a sack of black ember meal and 4 long strips of dried squash and a smaller paper bag of dried beans she had set aside for exactly this kind of evening. She set them on the table in front of Nell. She said the meal was not charity. She said the terms were simple. If Nell's family survived the winter and made it through to the spring planting, she would return twice the weight of grain she had received into a community seed chest that Ruth intended to establish before spring. No interest, no debt recorded in any ledger that would follow the family into next year. Just a responsibility and a promise, and the expectation that the promise would be kept. Nell looked at the sack for a moment. Then she looked at Ruth. She said quietly that she was sorry for the things that had been said. She did not specify which things, but Ruth understood the reference was not narrow. Ruth said that the winter was going to be long, and it would be better if they focused on getting through it. Nell nodded. She picked up the sack. Word moved through Bitterroot Flats, the way all words moved, in a small valley faster than the event it described, and arriving at most doors before Ruth had finished deciding how to handle the next visitor. Hiram Norris came on a Thursday, arriving at the gate with his hat in his hand and a directness that Ruth recognized as his form of apology, which was to say he had no form of apology and offered instead only the fact of his presence and his clear need. She gave him grain on the same terms she had given Nell. He agreed without discussion and left. Others came. Not a flood. A steady and dignified procession of families who had been managing the distance between pride and necessity with diminishing success, and who had finally arrived at the point where necessity won. Ruth gave to each of them. She kept strict records. Names, dates, quantities. The terms of the agreement written out in the plain. Ledger in her careful hand and signed when the person was willing, which most of them were. She explained the method with each distribution, not just the seed but the companion planting, the moisture management, the fire break, the dispersal of storage. She explained it in the way she had come to understand it herself through the combination of Edmund's written instructions and her own 25 years of standing on that specific piece of Dakota ground. She was not teaching from theory. She was teaching from the inside of the knowledge and the dried stalks. The fodder that Edmund had described in 3 careful pages in the back of the notebook and that she had stored through October against exactly this kind of need. She divided it among the families whose animals were most at risk, calculating what she could spare against what she needed to keep for the claim's own stock. When she was done, she had given away material that would carry 2 dairy cows and 11 draft horses through the worst months of winter. By December, the conversations in Bitterroot Flats had changed character. People were no longer asking whether Black Ember was cursed. They were asking how to grow it. The gathering at the church was Reverend Jonas Cray's idea, and he came to Ruth first to describe what he had in mind and ask whether she would attend. She told him she would. He looked relieved in a way that suggested he had prepared himself for a more difficult conversation. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the second week of December, with snow pressing against the windows and lantern light warm across the wooden walls. Ruth arrived early and sat near the front with Winifred Pickett beside her. Emmett Greer was there. Hiram Norris sat in the third row with his hat on his knee. Marshall Briggs stood near the back. Nell Spruill was there with her 2 children. Vernon Cade was in the room. He sat near the side wall, not conspicuously, but present the posture of a man who had decided that absence would serve him worse than watchfulness. Reverend Cray stood before the room with a plain ledger open in his hands. He spoke without ceremony. He said that the valley had spent most of a year arguing about a seed, and that the argument had been resolved by the land itself and by the work of one person who had been willing to stand behind an idea when the community around her was not. He did not describe this as a failing he was confessing. He described it as a fact he was recording, which Ruth understood as his most honest register. He said that what he was proposing was not a memorial to the difficulty of the past year. It was a practical structure for the years ahead. Every family that received Black Ember seed would record the quantity taken, the acreage planted, the expected return, and the portion they committed to returning to a shared chest. The chest would be maintained at the church, audited each autumn by Winifred Pickett and Emmett Greer, and made available to families who experienced shortfall, to widows, to elderly residents who could not plant at full scale, and to families with young children and limited labor. No family would be required to participate, but participation was the condition of access. Vernon rose from his place along the side wall. He said what Ruth had expected him to say. He said this was simply a different form of control, a single woman deciding who planted and who went without dressed in the language of community. The room was quiet while the accusation settled. Ruth rose. She said that no one in the room was required to take the seed. She said that the seed, the method, and the knowledge behind both were available to anyone who asked, without condition and without payment. She said that the only thing she required of anyone who took the seed was that they use it correctly and return a portion to the chest when their harvest allowed. She said that this was not control, it was responsibility, and responsibility was what a community owed to itself if it intended to remain one. She sat down. Vernon did not respond. He looked at the room. The room looked at him. Something in the air had settled in a way that made further argument feel less like disagreement and more like a different kind of exposure. In the silence that followed, Hiram Norris stood up. He did not speak. He walked to the front of the room where the Reverend had placed the ledger open on a table. He took the pen from beside it. He put his hat on the table next to the ledger. He wrote his name and placed a clear mark beside it. Then he turned and looked at Ruth. He asked her one question. How deep? 2 were not an apology, not an explanation, not the kind of speech that tries to account for a year of silence and distance by filling the air with noise. Just a direct and practical question from a man who had decided to move forward and wanted to know exactly what moving forward required. Ruth reached into her coat pocket. She brought out the knotted measuring cord, the one she had carried in her pocket since the day she first read Edmund's notebook by lamplight and understood what it was for. 22 knots. Each one a measurement. Each measurement a lesson Edmund had taken 15 years to learn and had trusted to the earth beneath their floor rather than to any other keeping. She stood and crossed to where Hiram was standing. She put the cord in his hand. He took it. He felt the knots with his thumb and his finger, one at a time, working from the first to the last, his eyes down. He was not counting them. He was feeling their spacing, understanding something about what they represented. He had been farming this ground for most of his adult life, and the cord was telling him in the language of physical things what that farming had not yet taught him. He folded the cord and put it in his breast pocket. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Then others came to the ledger. Not all of them, not Vernon, but most of the room found its way to the front table before the evening was done and each name entered in. The Reverend's careful hand was a small fact that had not existed an hour before. Winter passed in the way of Dakota winters, slowly and without apology, testing everything that had been built in the warmer months against the severity of what the cold months required. There were hard weeks. There were mornings when the temperature dropped to places that made the simplest outdoor work a matter of will. There were families who ran their stores lower than their plans had accounted for and came to the seed chest for the supplementary support it had been established to provide. But the families who had taken black ember grain in November and December did not go hungry. The livestock that had been fed on the dried stalks came through the worst of it without the losses that had thinned herds in previous hard winters. The community seed chest, modest as it was in its first season, fulfilled exactly the function the Reverend had described when he proposed it. Vernon Cade's store remained open. His shelves remained stocked. He continued to operate with the professional efficiency of a man whose livelihood had not been threatened, because it had not been. Nothing Ruth had done had taken food from his shelves or money from his accounts. What had changed was something less visible and more important. The absolute dependence that had given his ledger its power, the knowledge that a family with no other option had no choice but to accept his terms had been weakened, not eliminated. A season's harvest from 7 acres could not transform the economics of an entire valley. But it had introduced the possibility of an alternative, and possibility, once established, was not easy to remove. The spring came in the way. Springs came to Dakota Territory gradually, and then suddenly, with false warmth in February, giving way to a hard freeze in March before the real thaw arrived in late April. Ruth had lived through 38 of these transitions on this specific piece of ground, and she recognized each stage of it the way you recognize the different silences of a house you had lived in long enough to know all its sounds. She began preparing the field in the 3rd week of April. The soil had wintered well under the residual cover from the previous season's mulch, and when she dug test holes, she found moisture at depth that was encouraging for a field that had been through the drought she had just survived. The channels were intact. The fire break had held its shape. The land looked, she thought, like land that had been through something hard and had not been defeated by it. By the following June, Bitterroot Flats had changed in ways that were difficult to name precisely, but impossible to miss. From the ridge above town, if you stood in the right place on a morning, in late summer of that following year, you could see across most of the valley. Ruth had gone up there once to check on a section of fence that ran along the higher ground, and she had stood for a while and looked at what lay below. The differences were small. You would not notice them if you did not know what you were looking for. But she had been looking at that valley for 25 years, and she knew how it had looked before. There were water channels running through fields that had never contained them. thin lines of shadow from straw laid between rows visible even from the ridge. Squash vines spreading low across the ground in patterns she recognized from her own 7 acres. Small strips of bare earth at the southern margins of several properties, not enough for anyone unfamiliar with their purpose to understand what they were, but unmistakable to someone who had spent a season digging and maintaining one. The land looked less exhausted, not rich, not transformed into something it had never been. It was still Dakota territory, still hard and variable and indifferent to human plans. Rain was still unreliable. Wind was still constant. The weather would still do what the weather did, and the people living under it would still need to be ready for whatever it chose to offer. But the ground had been given something back. Not all that had been taken from it, not yet. Perhaps not in 1 generation, but a start had been made in 7 acres near a well, and it had moved outward from there the way things moved in small communities, through direct exchange and personal obligation, and the slow accumulation of evidence that a thing worked. On a morning in late September, after the second harvest had been counted, and the ledger updated and the seed chest at the church filled to a level that would carry the valley through a harder winter than the last one, Ruth walked east from the cabin toward the cottonwood tree. Brindle came with her. The white had spread further up his muzzle than she remembered, and he moved now with the measured economy of an old dog that has learned to conserve what it has left. He had not missed a single walk to this tree in 2 years. She had stopped expecting him to stay behind. The cottonwood stood where it had always stood, its pale trunk thicker looking in the September light, the leaves beginning the slow turn toward yellow that preceded their release each autumn. The grave was there, the simple marker, the quiet mound, beneath which Edmund Calloway had been resting for 2 years now. Ruth crouched beside it. She reached into the pocket of her coat and brought out a small handful of black ember seed. The kernels sat in her palm the way they had sat in the lamplight on the night she first opened the wooden chest, dark and dense, and holding the light with that faint sheen. She had handled these seeds almost daily for 2 years. She knew their weight and their texture better than she knew most things. She knew what they became in good soil with the right method. She knew what it had cost to demonstrate that, and she knew what the demonstration had produced. She set the seeds beside the marker. She stayed there for a while, not talking. The cottonwood moved in the September wind above her, its leaves making the sound they always made, a slow and gentle sound that she had come to associate over 25 years with the quality of late summer on this piece of ground. Beyond the grave, the field was visible. The cut rows of the harvested second season, the residual straw, the water channels running their careful angles toward the well. To the north and to the south, she could see the properties of people she had lived beside for most of her adult life, and she could see in the patterns of those fields the evidence of what had moved from her land to theirs over the past year. Edmund had not lived to see any of it. He had not seen Hiram Norris standing at the ledger with the knotted cord in his hands. He had not seen the flour come out of Emmett Greer's mill, the color of good earth. He had not seen the families who had survived a hard winter. On the grain he had spent 15 years learning to grow and protect. He had not seen the channels and the mulch and the fire breaks beginning to appear in fields across the valley, carrying his understanding forward into ground he had never stood on. He had seen something else. He had seen the 7 acres below the house on a spring morning and understood what they could be. He had recorded that understanding in a leather notebook and placed it under the floor and trusted it to whoever would be there when the time came. She thought about the line on the first page. They will call it cursed because they remember the wrong part of the old story. She had been thinking about that line for 2 years, since the first night she read it by lamplight. She understood it differently now than she had then. It was not simply a warning about the seed or about the valley's fear. It was a description of how memory worked when it was shaped by disaster, how the wrong element of a story could calcify into received truth and be passed down through years until no one remembered why they believed it, only that they did. Edmund had understood this and had refused to be governed by it. He had gone back to the beginning, past the fear and the rumor and the accumulated weight of the wrong story, and he had looked at the actual evidence and reached his own conclusion. And then he had spent 15 years turning that conclusion into something that could be handed to someone else, something concrete. Concrete and measured and rooted in the behavior of the land beneath their feet. She looked at the seeds she had placed beside the marker. Give to the earth before you ask. The earth does not forget a debt. The words had been carried forward through more generations than she could count, passed from hand to hand by people whose names she would never know, from a woman who had understood this land before any settler broke its surface, to a man who had written down what he learned in the space below his initials on a leather cover, to a woman crouching beside a grave in the September light, thinking about what it meant to be the keeper of a knowledge you had not originated. The wind moved through the cottonwood above her. The field lay behind her in the late afternoon light, the harvested rows running west toward the cabin, the whole 7 acres holding a quality of quiet that was not emptiness but completion. The quiet of a place where the work of a season has been done and the land has received it and is at rest. Brindle was lying in the grass near the base of the cottonwood. His chin rested on his front paws. He was watching the field in the way he had been watching it all season, with the patient attention of a creature who had decided a thing was worth watching. Ruth stood. She brushed her hands on her coat. She looked at the marker for a moment longer. The light was beginning to change in the west, the low evening shift that she had been watching at this hour, in this place, for 25 years. The cottonwood leaves moved again, a long, slow sound, like something breathing. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. The field was on her left as she walked, and she did not look at it directly, but she was aware of it. The way you were aware of something that had become part of you. Not as a separate thing you noticed, but as a condition of the landscape you carried with you. The roots were still there down past 30, past 40, past the compacted layers that most things could not reach. The soil was holding what it had been given. The debt that had been paid to it over 2 seasons was already beginning to return. Behind her, the cottonwood stood in the last of the light, and the seeds she had placed beside the marker rested in the grass, small and dark, and entirely capable of what they had always been capable of, waiting for the ground that would receive them. The rumors had gone from Bitterroot Flats, the way most rumors went, when the evidence finally became undeniable, not in any single moment, not with any ceremony, but gradually and without announcement replaced by the quieter and more durable thing that the evidence had produced. The seed remained.